Hello. I'm very honored to have been invited by Romy to respond to Mary Jacobus's quite extraordinary presentation. I was a little surprised by the invitation. I don't feel in any way qualified really to respond to such a paper. I'm not a CyTwombly expert, I'm a CyTwombly amateur, so that doesn't really qualify me. But anyway, I accepted to respond. And I will do my best. It does feel a bit like the goat as the gardener, because my admiration for Cytwombly and love for Cytwombly's work really stops where Mary Jacobus's love and admiration begins. That is, there's a strange asynchronicity in our Cytwombly interest. I think for me, Cytwombly's work begins in the mid-1950s, and it's reaching its extraordinary point in the early to mid-1960s, and precisely to the degree that Cytwombly's work engages with a more or less explicit set of references, metaphorizations to classical antiquity, the work seems to lose interest for me. And that, of course, brings us right to the heart of the matter of disagreement between Professor Jacobus's approach and mine around the question of metaphoricity and around the question of to what degree should the work or can the work be positioned in the type of transcendental humanist reading that I am very grateful for your criticism of Heiner Bastian's work. Precisely is embodied in Bastian's work in the most horrendous manner. Cytwombly is a historical compatriot, we could say, of Susan Sontag's, and there are many connections there. And Sontag's prohibition on metaphor and interpretation were clearly part of the culture of New York in which Cytwombly's work emerged at the time, and it is a very important dimension to retain when we think about Cytwombly's work at this moment. I phrased my questions to Mary Jacobus in 3 quotations. The first one is a quotation from Roland Barthes when he says, "In this conventional debate between science and subjectivity, I had arrived at this curious notion, why mightn't there be somehow a new science for each object, a mathesis singularis and no longer universalis?" And I think your wonderful paper clearly provides such a mathesis singularis for Cytwombly, and I will therefore respond with a call for, at least for the moment, to a mathesis universalis once again. I will play the role of the historian, not that I have a choice right now, insisting on the necessity for a contextualization that opposes the intensely private and singular dimensions that you detected in Cytwombly's work. The first of the questions that I will ask, therefore, is as follows. Is the regeneration of an iconographic interpretation of Cytwombly's work, late as it is, situated both in terms of attached to the later work of CyTwombly and late as it is emerging in the present moment? It's quite interesting to recognize that among Cytwombly's peers, i.e. Rauschenberg, Johns, and Warhol and Oldenburg, Cytwombly in many ways is the last of the artists of the late 50s, early 1960s to have received increasing recognition. In fact, Cytwombly for the longest part was completely neglected both by museum attention and market attention, all the way through the 70s when Cytwombly had his first major retrospective at the Whitney Museum, when Roland Barthes was commissioned to write his beautiful essay. Cytwombly was perceived as an outsider and in many ways as a failure within the American triumph of post-war art. The Whitney exhibition was universally canned as a disaster or as a complete failure. And it is quite important for us to recognize to what degree the delayed reception of Cytwombly's work might in fact be at least partially have been caused precisely by the very dimension that is now generating the increased interest and attention that his work has recently received, of which Professor Jacobus's attention is clearly a part. What this means is that we cannot apply your model of thinking about Twombly to the first 10 years of Twombly's work. The work that is void or free from any reference to mythology whatsoever. We cannot apply your proposals even to the work of the early 60s, paintings such as Empire of Flora, or Ferragosta, or Olympia, which carry similar iconic inscriptions and figures of speech and of drawing, but they do not permit such a consistent iconographic interpretation as the images that you have chosen seem to offer. Would it not be necessary, therefore, to remember, and I'm glad you did remember it today in the presentation, I didn't see it in the text, to uphold precisely those structuralist and formalist readings of Twombly's work, from Roland Barthes to Rosalind Krauss, those methodological models in interpretive operations that have explicitly rejected iconographic interpretation? Wouldn't it therefore necessary to make at least an attempt to weave these seemingly incompatible methods, iconography and formal structural interpretation, into a closer interaction than you seem to allow for? That is, pardon me, is it really desirable for us to engage in such an intense iconographical interpretation and make it the primary mode of reading, even if temporarily the structural and formal readings have situated Twombly in complex dialogic relations with the work of Jackson Pollock, with the pervasiveness of the grotesque, with the graffito in surrealist and post-surrealist automatism, or situate him in the context of universal tendency towards monochromatic or even achromatic painting that governed painterly practices of many artists at that time, from Lucio Fontana and Piero Manzoni in Italy to Johns and Rauschenberg, Twombly's closest allies and friends in the United States. This question comes into focus in particular in the final part of your presentation, where it addresses the question of the analogy between sculpture and the excrement, which were clearly on many sculptors and many artists' minds in the early 1960s, whether it was Piero Manzoni or Carl Andre, who addressed exactly the same questions with similar means and similar structures and similar operations, whether it was plaster or actual feces, as it was the case in Manzoni's work. So once again, the question is posed, can we work towards a possible correlation or reconciliation or parallel reading of the results of these approaches with the undoubtedly very rich and challenging results of your own presentation? The second set of questions begins with a citation from Claude Lévi-Strauss in his Finale, in the last chapter of The Naked Man, where he says, "We have to resign ourselves to the fact that myths tell us nothing instructive about the order of the world, the nature of reality, or the order and destiny of mankind. We cannot expect them to flatter our metaphysical thirst or to breathe new life into exhausted ideologies." End of quote. I'm using this undoubtedly outdated foundational structuralist credo, clearly very problematical from almost all contemporary perspectives, as a point of departure to ask the following set of questions. A, you approach Twombly's more or less systematical or at least consistent citations of scenes and figures from the myths of Greek and Roman mythology with the most generous credulity, as though, in fact, it was perfectly common and plausible to develop an oeuvre in the period after World War II, in which such references to the persistence of mythological antiquity within the present, which had been the focus even still of Abby Warburg in the 1920s, as though that focus had still retained a perfectly compelling cultural cachet in the post-war period. When in fact, we could argue that without too much exaggeration, Twombly's choices were almost unique and incomparable, certainly in the context of post-war American art of the second generation. That is, his most important peers, friends, and lovers, Robert Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns. For them, just as much as for Andy Warhol or Klaas Oldenburg, who were born more or less the same year as Twombly, any such citation would have appeared to be totally unacceptable for a variety of reasons. The most notoriously certainly would have been the insight that European bourgeois culture had totally failed and needed to be left behind as radically and rapidly as humanly possible. One way of achieving this goal was precisely the introduction of a specifically American and post-bourgeois mass cultural iconography, the iconography of the everyday life and the collective that was introduced by Johns, Rauschenberg, and then massively formulated by Warhol. The only artist of the 20th century who had desperately attempted to uphold or to reintroduce references to classical antiquity in the post-war period was, of course, Picasso. And we know all too well that that was, for the most part, driven by a belated retour à l'ordre impulse to situate himself once again within the phantasmagoria of Latinity and Mediterranean culture. We could even go as far as stating that it had been one of the foundational strategies of modernism to publicly and programmatically detach itself from the presumed foundations of Western culture in classical antiquity and its mediation of the Renaissance. If you think of Manet, Cézanne, all the way to Picasso's Cubism and to Duchamp, it is precisely their dislodging and their detachment, if not their defacing of those transhistorical claims from the persistence of antiquity that had been battle cries and strategy for modernity and modernism throughout. And only in the most vociferous anti-modernist moments, from the Chirico to the Picasso in the Retour à l'ordre, to fascism itself, the return to these phantasmagoric foundations was declared as possible and desirable. Thus, it is all the more astonishing and provocative to find such a return to the myths of classical antiquity in the work of a post-Holocaust American artist, who admittedly relocates in the early 1950s to Italy, no doubt in part to escape from the rise of American mass culture and its incessant desublimation of the bourgeois subject. It is precisely for that reason that Twombly might have attempted to recuperate the shards of Italy's post-fascist reconstruction. As a historian of art, I would consider it to be among my tasks to develop and differentiate as many of these contextual contingencies and bring them into an increasingly specific reading of the work. Whereas it appears to me that your approach situates Twombly's work in a rather lofty space of a continuing tradition of Western European considerations and contemplations of the continuity of classical antiquity in the present. In a sense, a trans-historical foundation of our subjectivity, very much in the way that Freud used the perpetual return to figures and images and scenes from antiquity as the foundational structure of bourgeois subjectivity. Or even in the way that Adorno and Horkheimer returned to Ulysses as the first bourgeois subject in their meditations on the destructions of that subject in 1947 in the Dialectics of Enlightenment, written from a distinctly American position of the émigrés having barely escaped from the Holocaust. My third quotation is from Donald Judd in 1964. CyTwombly's paintings discourse on commodities are a fiasco, end of quote. I guess it all comes down to which of the layers of signification and meaning we prioritize in our responses to an artist's work. Clearly, Donald Judd, who was basically one of the first supporters of Twombly's paintings, responded quite differently to the series on Commodus that you have given ample and very interesting interpretations. What did Judd miss then in these paintings? Or what did you see that Judd considered irrelevant for a contemporary discussion of what constitutes artistic practice in the present? Clearly, Judd situated the meaning and the significance of the work within its capacity to be specific in its interventions within previously governing conventions of painting and sculpture. The precision with which an artist could effect the structures and orders of perceptual organization of object and spectatorial response were the sites where meaning was actually situated. You, by contrast, situate meaning, or you seem to privilege Twombly's meaning primarily in his undoubtedly exorbitant capacities to cite and invoke references to history, to the literary cultures of the myths of Greco-Roman antiquity, but not in the manner that these paintings speak to the question of how and what constitutes a credible articulation of painterly or sculptural form in the present. What is the impact of your approach, at least from Judd's perspective? It is an effect of dehistoricization, and I would agree with you in the sense that precisely those formal and procedural principles that made Twombly's work extraordinary for that moment make it appear in your reading as a relatively conventional cultural project. However, with slightly different forms of inscription and execution, rather than, as I would argue, with fundamentally different model of identity formation and subject constitution. The same argument could be made perhaps even more forcefully with regard to the implicit declaration of the structures of sexuality and gendered identity pronounced in Twombly's work. Your eloquence in resituating Twombly in almost all instances within a predecessor of the catalogues of heroes from classical antiquity has an involuntary effect, at least for me, namely that the subversive, scatological, and anal erotic subtext of Twombly's paintings from the 50s onwards, which must have clearly served as some hidden manifesto of gay liberation at that time, is totally absorbed within your classicizing account. And my last question is probably the most difficult one that I cannot answer myself, but I will formulate it anyway. I would bet to dispute your argument or speculation that Twombly's work, in fact, does respond to experiences of recent wars fought by his compatriots, from Vietnam to the First and the Second War in Iraq. If in fact that would be the case, would we not have to pose the question that if any such explicitly referential and critical project was indeed part of Twombly's artistic arsenal, would the procedures of representing the experience of war, for example, with red traces of paint, as he mentioned once, would it not suffer from a certain naivete or catastrophic harmlessness, given the magnitude of the technological monstrosities with which these wars are actually being fought in the present? Or, allow me to reverse the question one more time. Isn't the association of these wars of our present-day experience with the classical stories of the heroes of Athenian warfare then itself all too easily misread as a mystification of the eternity and profoundly human nature of all wars, of all times and all places, that once again would have an inevitable and certainly unintended effect of mystifying war as a transhistorical essence of the human condition? Thank you.
We don't each of you have to go to the witness.
Okay.
I think we should stand up.
Sure.
Yeah, because I can't.
We can stand together.
We can stand together.
Yeah.
Well, sort of. I'm glad to be still standing after that onslaught. I didn't quite know where to begin. I want to begin with just your end point, because I think that we have a different view about what I was doing, which I see as appropriative. I have a real question about Twombly's politics. It certainly was not formed in East Germany, unlike Victor, and undoubtedly did not have the same political or subject formation. Whether or not he is himself subsuming war into the timeless and therefore inevitable nature of human conflict, I myself am not doing that, and I hope that was abundantly clear. And I think that when one writes, one can indeed write from the position of somebody who wishes to make works say something about the kind of outrage that I think Judith Butler and citing to you about at the beginning and at the end. So I just want to say that we don't know what I don't know. I haven't asked him what Twombly thinks about war. I started by saying I was certainly wanting to very much contest the Bastian reading of Twombly, and I continue to say that. And some of what you said seemed to me to deliberately distort what I said, actually, I think. I actually agree with you that in liking Twombly's work of the late 50s, early 60s best myself. But of course, if you're interested in artists, you're kind of interested, as one is with Victor, in all versions. And Victor is an incredibly varied painter. And I think that Twombly was too. And the metaphoricity question you raised, I think, is interesting. But I think there are a number of different ways to be Twombly. And I have other chapters where I'm interested in doing a different kind of reading and not working from my own position, my own subject position, as I think I was doing here. For me, Twombly's subject position is a bit of a mystery, I have to say. But apart from that, I think there are very interesting questions. I mean, Barthes himself, Barthes' own brilliant essays on Twombly remain, I think, some of the best things written about Twombly, but they're very good, partly because they pay no attention to the art object whatsoever. They simply treat it as the equivalent of the vitally, the scriptival, as opposed to the musible text. And in other words, Twombly painting is completely empty for the kind of reading which is rewriting that Barthes likes to do. And I think the one from Murray is that I want to do a Twombly, and of course he finds it difficult, but what he's moved to do is fill that space with a variety of his own writerly projects. Although he sounds as though he's severely asking for, I didn't quite get the quote down right, but that you can just singularis, the
mathematics singularis,
thank you. One of the points I think you're making is that an iconographic reading from is problematic. And I agree. I felt there's something kind of clunky about saying, well, this looks like a stele or an avon or something. But I wonder if Twombly himself says very interestingly, I'm an abstractionist, I'm not a pure abstractionist. And there's a very interesting early painting of 1961, I think, where he actually produces a little kind of gloss on his use of colour. And he has this little white cloud, and says that's filled with some dreams, and he has a black cloud, and he has some other earth colour, flesh colour. There is an element, if not an iconographic element, and I completely agree with you that one could see what I was doing as kind of clunky. I think there is a referential element in Twombly that one should not ignore. And I just want to sort of put that on the table. Now, one of the things I was trying to do, I don't myself like the discourse on Commodus, and was happy to skip over it. But I do think that there's something very interesting about Twombly's interest in violence at this point. And that the one thing I did think was kind of interesting was the idea that in his own very different way, coming out of Fellini's realm, etc., he might be doing what Warhol was doing with the 13 Most Wanted Men and Death and Disaster and all the rest of it. There are many ways to do that. The Twomblys have become somewhat cut off. This is only one little strand of an amazing output at this point. And at this point he's also, to say, painting the School of Fontainebleau, the Empire of Flores, also painting remarkable works which sort of speak to the question of Raphael's, the erratic work of Il Panosso and the School of Athens, by in effect doing something citational that is about the nature of art itself, I think, in a way, about the nature of his art. What does the modern avant-garde artist do confronted by these works? How can one, as it were, not succumb to this sort of cultural environment that he's in? And some of the contemporary Italians, in fact, the person, I think it might have been Clementi, who says, yeah, we all think we should join the revolution, and there was Twombly, doing this stuff using classical reference, said how inspiring it was and how extraordinary it was to find somebody using this context that they themselves had regarded, yes, in the post-war situation as just highly problematic. Throughout this essay, of course, I was very much trying not to get into the question of so much has been written on post-Holocaust, on Holocaust memorials. I was trying to go away from that to find another way of thinking of the question of memorialization, which I do think is unaddressed in relation to modern wars. One doesn't have to say any more, but I think the question of who gets memorialized, why, and the relation of shame to the absence of moral ignorance to the absence of memorialization in war, I think is still a very living issue.
Mary,
can I say any more? No, I want to say a little bit more. I just want to say a little bit more. I just want to say a little bit more. All right, I will stop. So just to quickly take up the point, yes, one of course should be wheeling the former iconographical, and I hope to in our chapters. You're absolutely right. Levi-Strauss, the question of those the relation of the American post-war sort of collectivity of popular culture, yes, Twombly is of course cut off from that. It was not, I think, quite as cut off as one might imagine, after all he's continually close to Rauschenberg and Johns. One thing I do want to say is that actually, far from ignoring the sexuality question, I'm very interested in it, and I think that there's been a lot of pussyfooting, if I can use that word, pussyfooting around Twombly's the question of whether or not there is some kind of gay aesthetic in Twombly, the very open references, scatological references, anal references, etc., etc. It's there, and so are some other wonderful paintings about female sexuality, and the Roberta Venus paintings are amazing. But I think there is, and then I have elsewhere tried to write about this as the kind of disappeared body of the male lover in Twombly. And I think it's tremendously interesting. It's sort of there on the web, but in terms of there's some blogs about it, but in terms of his era, but also of the writing about Twombly, incredible decorousness prevails. It's almost impossible to talk about this, I think, or has been. And I think finding a good way to talk about it, which doesn't sort of invent him sort of after the event as an out there proponent of gay art, it is important and important to do. So I just want to say that the last thing I want to do, in fact, of course, the point about the Iliad is it is about love between men, and some things I didn't quote, but I mean I think it's very interesting that Twombly returns to this very powerful account of homoerotic love and homoerotic militarism, because the two are intimately connected. Have I more to say? Well, I think probably everybody else should say that. I must say Judd, who I think Judd says, well, there's no ideas in Commode. It's just empty, even vacuous. I sort of agree, I think it is problematic. But there are, I think other people have written on Twombly since. I felt that your account of Twombly resonates very much with the sort of Rosalind Krauss moment. It's just art informel, and it's the moment of the early 60s, basically, late 50s, early 60s. We sort of canonizes a particular kind of Twombly. I didn't think that's a sufficient account of Twombly. I think it's very, if I may say so, I think it is itself dates down to history. And I would like to rethink that. I think that's without just being sort of gaga about later Twombly. So I think I'll stop there. I've taken careful notes, and perhaps I can ask you for that, because it will be very helpful to me in my work.
I'm very sorry if it came across as aggressive. It was really a rhetorical device to generate the discussion. I suppose I underestimate my...
Can we have some questions now?
Yes. But I think for both of us.
Could you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Karen Krasinski. I'm a former student of Professor Boudreau, but I was fascinated by your... I'm sorry. My name is Karen Krasinski. I was fascinated by your talk, and I have a question. If you could say a little bit more. I agree with you that Barth's writing on Twombly is some of the best, and I'm fascinated with his analysis of semiotics and the role of writing and erasure. And I wonder if you could connect your discussion of the iconography in Twombly's work to connect your discussion of iconography to the writing of history and how his work, the formal language, comes in to relate to history as a palimpsest and that way of approaching.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. It's a chapter I have yet to write. I'm writing at the moment about reading in the other essay. There are two part essays. The second one is called The Wisdom of Art. And the first one is the one where he's marvelous on the graphological element and the history of writing is of course crucial. He sort of invents all these ways of writing that relate to earlier forms of fiction, sometimes quite made up. If that's what you're asking, I think there is a whole, and I anticipate somewhat Derridean chapter to be written there, which I look forward to writing. Does it has to be posed as a history of writing? Which I think you were asking.
Also about writing versus picturing, and the way that he connects the visual science and the written side, and then crossing out of both at the same time, which drawing is able to do, but painting isn't able to do that.
Right.
So it's both picturing, history, and writing.
Right. Well, of course, his erasure, it's very difficult in reproductions because he erases with paint, paints over his own writing, and painting he erases also his writing. And the whole question of erasure and layering, I think, is very interesting. And treating the canvas like a wall, a flat wall, I think, is also very interesting. He himself objects somewhat to the sort of old-fashioned southern way. There's a term graffiti, though I think it is quite interesting to think of it as graffiti because it's written on objects. And of course with his sculptures he also writes on objects in a way, sort of paints on them, but writes on them. But the use of the surface as if it were, as if it had depth, I think is very, as if like a wall. I think it's very interesting. And it relates to the question of the flatness of the canvas also, I think. In some of the, I just was talking about mentioned of Parnasso, his own painting, of course, in that wonderful Raphael painting, there is an interruptible window, and Twombly, which is ignored, as it were, except as a way to build a painting by Raphael, Twombly simply draws in the outline of that window and then writes his name there, and the title and the date. And that is sort of, this window is not a window, as it were, that's surrealism. It I think is doing something very interesting with the question of the flatness of the surface as that on which he writes, paints. In terms of the graphic line and the ductus, or the graphic line and the written line, there are tremendously interesting intersections, sometimes non-meeting intersections, I think. I'm not offering you really a theory of this, I don't feel able to, but I'm sure you're aware of those big paintings that belong to the same period as the synopsis of the battle. But those, of course, take the ductus of the hand to the level of the entire body, the bodily ductus. The whole body becomes the writing machine, if you like. So I think there's, yes, it's a fascinating question, and I think very much there to be written and thought about. Thank you.
We have time for 2 more questions. I want to end around 8.
There were so many questionable things, Benjamin, in your response. It's hard to know where to begin. But
are you talking to me?
No, I'm talking to Benjamin.
Oh, good.
But I have got a question for you, Mary.
Oh.
But in this really rapid and certainly deeply ungenerous and in my view deeply questionable series of objections, why don't we just pick on one? And that was the prohibition that you were posing on recollections of classical iconography. These paintings, the evocation of iconography is absolutely inevitable because they've got the names of figures written all over them. We can't help but think iconographically. But you were saying that this is should be prohibited because it suggests kind of perhaps a transcendental bourgeois subject, which I know from previous talks you would like to see destroyed.
James, can I ask you, you will have an opportunity for further discussion.
Thank you.
Put your
But
question.
the question would be about the form of these iconographic references, because they seem to me to be drawn from and echoing stage designs or stage sets, the occasion for future replays of this. They are so far from evoking the transcendental subject that they are memories and they are evocations, and the very sketchiness of those those paintings, which I take to be evoking stage designs, is itself very conscious of not falling into the trap of evoking a transcendental subject. So it's really a question for Mary in particular about the form of the writing, the sketches, the sketch effect of these paintings.
James, forgive me, you want to ask a question about the sketchiness itself?
Yeah.
Okay, what effect does that have? Yeah. Well, that's a very interesting question. I'm not sure I can answer that. Of course, Twombly is enormously evocative by these unfilled in, these sketch effects. And I think you were really pointing to the way in which they reshape memory. They both evoke and shape memory. When you talk about stage sets, we talked about the 50 Days of Iliad. I don't know if you've seen them. I mean, they're huge. I had never thought of them as stage sets. So it's an interesting, against which a sort of imaginary fight goes on. I had thought of them as some way about themselves, about the image, about the nature of the image, and the force of the image, which I'm going to. And I think, these paintings seem to be full of violence, absolutely full of violence, and full of the question about violence. There is the image violence. As Nancy is suggesting, there is a kind of violence in truth, as well as the violence of blunt, stupid violence. And if so, what do we do with that? It seems to me that whether or not this is Twombly's private hang-ups and private subjectivity on paper, I don't think that's the only way in which, he certainly is extremely interested in how the hand is violent in a way that makes me think of Klein's boy during the Second World War scribbling on the paper, stabbing the paper, injuring the paper. But that's psychoanalysis, and I was being rather careful not to be psychoanalytic of Twombly, though I think that the question of violence sort of remains in some of these. Some of them, of course, are extraordinarily elegant, and the elegance of Twombly is also a besetting problem. The elegance that he tried to destroy in his own mind, and you see it all over the place, including in his writing. But it's one of the, and it's one of the things that attracts Bart, is the sheer elegance of it, I think. And the elegance is of saying, like a sketch, of saying or writing less rather than more.
I have a question. No final question?
Is there a question about Homer?
What's that?
Is
Homer.
there a question? Could someone ask a question about Homer?
Is Mr. Lage here by any chance?
I'm here.
Oh, yeah, I thank you.
And I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation, was very engaged with it, and I'm so glad you talked about I'm fairly loud, so I think you could all hear when I said up to this point. So anyway, I found myself very engaged with your application of your own knowledge of Homer, and especially the folk translations and that beautiful illustration of how 18th century eyes look at Achilles. And I think what brings everything together was the way you talked just a few minutes ago about ductus, which I think is so important as a way of bringing motor activities, visual arts, and verbal arts together, and it's all there. And what you said just a minute ago, and I don't know whether this is common knowledge, that Twombly tries to destroy his own mind. I thought said it all.
Thank you very much. This was a very passionate event, and I hope we will continue with the discussion. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Benjamin. Thank you all for being with us.